Kia ora tātou. Welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. I'm Mika, and I'm here with Rayne. In this episode, we interview Nick Townsend. Nick Townsend is an academic who came to chat with us all the way from England. He specialises in Christian politics and ethics. In this podcast, we talk to Nick about the common good, what it is, and how it might shape society. We had lots of fun having this conversation with Nick. Thank you very much for coming and joining us all the way from England.
Before we begin the podcast, we want to read out Nick's working definition of the common good, since it had to be cut from the body of the podcast because of sound issues. The quote can be found at Together for the Common Good, which we have linked in the show notes. Quote, "The common good is the shared life of a society in which everyone can flourish, as we act together in different ways that all contribute towards that goal, enabled by social conditions that mean every single person can participate. We create these conditions and pursue that goal by working together across our differences, each of us taking responsibility according to our calling and ability." End quote. This conceptualisation of the common good is what Nick was talking about throughout the episode. Another quote which Nick included, which also had to be cut, comes from Catholic social teaching, which reads, "The common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each individual. Rather, belonging to everyone and to each person, it is indivisible, and only together is it possible to attain it." End quote.
I actually had a coffee during us recording this podcast.
Did you?
Yeah, because I'd just come back from work and the trains where I started work at 3 a.m. Then got back and we're interviewing this guy at 10:30 or 11, and I was shattered, and then I had 11 a.m. coffee, and then I was great. It's probably in the podcast that I'm just buzzed beyond belief. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode. It's a long one and it's got a little bit of a audio issue, but it is well worth listening to, so thanks for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you here. Could you start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about who you are?
Sure. Well, it's a real delight to be here. My name is Nick Townsend. Anyone listening to this will be clear that I have a British English accent, but I was actually born in New Zealand. I was born in Nelson, like Mika here.
Wonderful.
My mother was a New Zealander. She was born and bred in Dunedin, and my father was British. And my mother went off way back in the 1950s as a young woman to do what later came to be called OE, relatively pioneering in those days. She went with a friend. And anyway, she met the person who became my dad and who she married. She met him 3 weeks before she was due to come back. As she came back to Dunedin, as she had promised her father she would be by a particular Christmas, they then corresponded for 3 years.
Whoa. In
a very old-fashioned way by letter, and eventually she went back and they decided to marry. And 6 months after they married in the UK, they moved to New Zealand, and they moved to Nelson. Lived in Nelson for just 2 years, and I was born there. And then, because of a different job that my father got, moved to Lower Hutt. So I then lived not many miles from here until I was 8, and I went to school in Lower Hutt for a few years at Taita Central School. And my dad's job also was in Lower Hutt. So as a young child growing up, got to know the Wellington area, and I actually love Wellington. I think it's a great place. And when I was 8, and my sister a little bit younger than me, my parents decided that we would go to the UK to live. And so we moved, and that was just at the end of the era when travel was by ship. So we went by ship, which was a very exciting thing for a couple of young kids, and we were old enough to be able to experience it and remember it. And we moved to Exeter in Devon, a part which is in the southwest of the UK. It's a really nice part of the UK. And my parents had no previous connections with that area in terms of family, but they knew it was a nice part of the country to live in, and that's why they moved there, along with one or two other reasons. And so I grew up in Exeter, and it was a good place to grow up, and I got on well in the UK. And on balance, I think I'm kind of glad that we moved to the UK. When I come back to New Zealand, I've come to New Zealand, this is my 4th trip to New Zealand as an adult, and they've been on average once every 13 years, I worked out. So you will be able to work out my age from that, but don't do it in the podcast. When I've come back to New Zealand, especially on this trip, the experience is a bit like unearthing a layer that is usually out of sight or out of view. Because I speak with a British accent, in the UK, most people, my friends, people I know, people I work with, they just kind of assume I'm British, that I'm from the south of the UK, because I, broadly speaking, have a sort of south of England kind of accent. But especially because my mother was from New Zealand, most of my extended family is in New Zealand because it was on my mother's side. Throughout my life, there's been this sort of layer underneath of being a New Zealander originally, and of ongoing connection with family here and some friends, especially Jonathan and Mary Boston, I've known for a very long time. They're my only really long-standing friends here who are unconnected with family, who I'm staying with at the moment. Wonderful people. So when I come here, it's as though there's this layer that is sort of unearthed, and I sort of live on that layer for a while. I'm here for 8 weeks on this trip, which is a wonderful long trip, and of course I come to have this conversation with you in the middle of what is an extraordinarily long holiday in effect, so I hope my brain can half get into gear as our conversation develops. So then I lived in the UK after that, and I studied in my first degree politics and economics, mainly with also philosophy, but I stopped the philosophy after the first year, though in retrospect I wish I'd kept the philosophy going and dropped the economics, which I also loved at the time, but I grew to love it less. And then I worked in the private sector for a short time. Then I worked for a politician in Westminster for 3 years as a sort of researcher and the like. And then I started doing postgraduate study, which was under the general heading of Christian theology, though my first degree had not been in Christian theology, but focusing on ethics and Christian political thought. And I did postgraduate study for a number of years under a supervisor called Oliver O'Donovan, who is a leading Anglican contributor to Christian ethics and a kind of revival of Christian political thought and political theology of a certain sort. His work is extremely impressive, but also not very accessible or easy to understand, like, a number of people who contribute in significant ways. So his influence has not been as great as it might have been so far if his work had been easier to understand. I then continued in academic work, broadly speaking. I've had a number of jobs in a number of different colleges, each of them connected with a wider university setting. One in Oxford, where I'd done my postgraduate study, then at a college in Salisbury in the south of England called Sarum College, which at the time I was there was an extremely interesting multi-denominational college that had been formed in the buildings in which an earlier college had closed. We had people right across the denominational spectrum crossing the Catholic-Protestant divide, and that made it an absolutely great place to be. We ran a programme there all about politics and Christian theology, and I was the director of that for a few years. That was the best job I've ever had. It was a fantastic job. I really loved doing that. Unfortunately, that programme was not in itself financially sustainable, so it was not continued by the college after a certain period. But that was after I'd in fact left to go to another job in London, where most of the students I worked with, though not all, were training for ordained ministry in the Church of England or the Methodist Church or the United Reformed Church. We also had a small number who were training for ministry in the Lutheran Church in the United Kingdom. I appreciated the multi-denominational aspect of that job too, and I was employed to teach Christian doctrine, which I'd never really studied before, and I loved having to study it under pressure to teach it, and Christian ethics, and I had quite a big administrative role in that job too. In the last decade or so, I had not had a single main job. I was working sort of freelance or independently. I worked for some years on quite a big project on Catholic social teaching for a Catholic university in Birmingham in the UK, Newman University. But that came against a background of, for a time after I was doing full-time postgraduate study, I worked in the Catholic College in Oxford, a college for mature students. It wasn't connected with the university. It was a residential college. It was for people who had not succeeded in education first time round and were of all ages. And in fact, most of the people there were people who'd had problems of one sort or another in their lives. And it was an amazing mix of people who were recovering alcoholics or been through divorce or had been unemployed for a time. And in the UK, historically, a large proportion of those who are Roman Catholics have come from working class backgrounds, and many of the people at that college were from those sorts of backgrounds. And I lived there as well as working there. And my own Christian background although I have actually very staunch Roman Catholicism on my mother's side of my family, that played no part in my own upbringing. And I came to Christianity through evangelical Christianity. And what working in this Catholic college in Oxford brought home to me with very great force was the tragedy of Christian division, because I had more in common as a Christian believer with some of the very devout Catholics who were among the student body and on the staff than any of the theological points on which I might have continued to disagree with them. And so ever since then I've had a very strong sense of commitment to doing whatever I might be able to do in a very limited way to seeking to enable the recovery of Christian unity. I think God must lament the extent of Christian division of various sorts, an effect of that particular moment in my life, which then has continued. In more recent years, just to conclude this little autobiographical account, I went back from London and lived with my mother in Devon, where she lived after my father died. I continued to live with her for the remaining part of her life, except the last 6 months when she went in a care home. And it was a good experience to have the opportunity to do that. Her cognitive capacities continued in good order until about the last 18 months or 2 years of her life. A great person. And she died last year, and so when I return from this trip, I will be getting back into my normal areas of work, and I have a project where I want to develop web-based educational resources on Christian politics, basically, and I've wanted to do that for a long time, and I think I'm probably just about in a position to do that now, along with ongoing lecturing work that I have on a part-time basis.
Christian faith and politics is a very broad area. Is there any particular focuses within that you've worked on or that have been most meaningful to you?
Yes, thank you for that question. A couple of things I think I'd say in response to that. One is, through the period of my postgraduate study and learning from Oliver O'Donovan and others, I think I have probably a stronger sense than perhaps many Christians do of the extent of the resources that there are in the Christian tradition that really can inform a kind of Christian politics. You know, people do often say about Christians who participate in contemporary democratic politics in Western societies, you know, Christians can be in this party and they can be in that party and they can be the other party, and it's great that they are in all the parties, and it's possible to be a faithful Christian holding a range of different views across the spectrum of political views that there are typically in our sort of broadly liberal democracies, if they can still be called that. And I don't really disagree with that, but I think the resources that there are in Christian thought for articulating a distinctive Christian position are fuller, and one can go further than perhaps some other Christians think. And I would point to, as evidence of that, the European continental, capital C, capital D, Christian democratic political tradition, of which we in the English-speaking Western world, and let me include New Zealand under that heading for the time being, at any rate, I know that that's not a full or adequate description of New Zealand in the world as it is now. But we in the English-speaking Western world are lamentably ignorant about the European continental Christian democratic tradition, which has also had important manifestations in Latin America. It has been most prominent in Germany with the Christian Democratic Party, the CDU, of which and Angela Merkel in recent times, and before her Helmut Kohl, were the most prominent public representatives as Chancellor of Germany. Now, I don't know what you think about this, Mika, from your own family's German background, but as I see it, it is lazy journalese when English-speaking Western journalists simply equate Christian democratic politics with conservatism in the English-speaking world. The tradition from which Christian democratic politics draws, especially in the post-World War II period, is in a sense deeply different from the sources that have formed conservative politics, especially in more recent years with the rise and embrace in conservative politics of neoliberalism in recent decades. And those sources lie in Catholic social teaching. The Christian democratic parties, as they formed during the 20th century, understood themselves to be centre parties across the wider conventional political spectrum. They tended to use such terms as the radical centre for what they represented. And so in relation to the topic we're going to go on to look at today, I think the concept of the common good, the concept of the social purpose of private property, for example, and of private business as necessarily to contribute to the common good, and other sources generate a political position that is in fact profoundly different from the dominant political ideologies, as we can call them, in English-speaking Western political discourse. I haven't said enough to justify that claim then, but if I only am referring to that form of politics, which itself has been subject to all sorts of internal tensions and failings in recent times, the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, for example, that had been very prominent in Italian politics since the Second World War, collapsed amid completely justified scandals to do with corruption in the 1990s, which is not what you want from any form of politics that claims the label Christian, obviously not. So, that political tradition has had major problems within it. But I think in the forms of thought that have formed that tradition, there was a drawing on the Christian tradition, Catholic and also Protestant, has been quite deep and generates, as I say, a distinctive position. And so that's by way of example of the wider point that I'm making, that I would think that I think that the Christian tradition can do more than most people think it can to inform a cogent politics in our age. And in terms of the other aspect of your question, I worked in politics for 3 years. I was then a political activist in a political party in the UK for some years. Though political activism doesn't come naturally to me, I always greatly admired those people I could see to whom it came completely naturally. I worked, in Parliament, dealing with legislation, all sorts of things like that, and it gave me an acute sense of the pressure that politicians are under to answer questions now on difficult issues, and the urgency of that, and the importance of enabling the articulation of insights from Christianity for Christian politicians that they can actually use in the practice of politics. And I think there's a bit of a gulf between a lot of the literature, the academic literature that goes under the label political theology, and what real politicians have to deal with. And you can't blame the real politicians for not finding a lot of that literature very helpful, because that is a sort of self-contained academic literature often, which its authors sometimes don't have the acute sense of the kinds of ways in which politicians have to make decisions about very difficult issues suddenly and quickly. So I think there is a gulf, and I have a sense of the huge importance of trying to articulate things in ways that overcome that gulf. I've written a number of articles, but I've not written a book. But I hope to write a lot more, say, in the next 10 years, and articulate it through various media than I've done in the past.
In the interest of overcoming that gulf, and just before we move on to talking about the common good, you're talking about Christian democratic politics and all of the various rich traditions that inform Christian politicians in Europe. And you've said that that's typically characterised by this sort of radical centre. Do you have any other... What are some things that characterise Christian democratic politics? Can you tease out some...
I will answer
threads?
that in a very specific way, partly in order to avoid us being too diverted by that, and in a self-referential way, because anyone listening to this can find on the internet an introduction to Christian democratic politics, which I have written. And I actually myself put a link to it some time ago. It was written in about 2015. I put a link to it on the Wikipedia page about Christian democratic politics. So I commend that, because that was intended as an introduction for people in the UK in particular to the tradition of Christian democratic politics, which I was privileged to learn about, not least from a great figure, the late Michael Fogarty, a British academic who ended up, through some strange concatenation of events, actually writing what became the kind of classic academic text on Christian democratic politics, published in the 1950s.
So the common good and the concept of the common good, would you say that that's sort of a key to Christian democratic politics? How would you introduce the common good?
I would say it's one crucial concept in Christian political thought more widely. Let's leave behind Christian democratic politics per se at the moment. I'm not here to discuss that as such, and it's a big and controversial subject of its own. So I think that drawing from the scriptures in the first place, one can find a number of really important concepts which have to inform Christian thinking about society and politics. They include, for example, both terms in a very frequent pairing in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, which everyone will be familiar with, usually translated as justice and righteousness, or righteousness and justice. That pairing comes many times in the Psalms, in the prophets, and in other places. In fact, standard English translation of those terms isn't great, because those two terms, let me give you the Hebrew words mishpat and tzedek or tzedakah. Mishpat actually means judgment in court. It specifically means judgment in court. It almost always means judgment in court. And tzedek means justice in a wider sense. It also can have the connotation of vindication. And often when you have this pairing, it's about the way that those who have political authority in ancient Israel, they are responsible for ensuring that there are courts which those people who have a legitimate complaint, a legitimate grievance, because they have been exploited by their employer in some way, or they've suffered violence, or they are struggling because they are in poverty, because they're not getting what they need. In many places in the Psalms and the prophets, there's reference to the idea that the aggrieved people, the suffering people, often in Hebrew the anawim, which literally means the bowed down, often translated simply as the poor, can go to the court and get a hearing and get a judgment which vindicates them against the person who is exploiting them or who has been violent towards them. And mishpat means that. So I wanted to refer at the beginning to Psalm 72, which is a fascinating psalm. It's a portrait of an ideal king. And reading it relatively literally, this is the Good News Bible, actually, which does relatively well. It says, teach the king to judge. The word is mishpat. Some translations just have justice, which normally in our usage is a more abstract concept, whereas mishpat is a noun of action. It's saying it's about the act of judgment. Teach the king to judge with your righteousness, O God. The other word there is tzedek. So we could say, teach the king to judge, to practice mishpat, judgment, with your justice, O God, we could say. Share with him your own justice. I think that is either mishpat or tzedek, I can't remember which, and the next verse, so that he will rule over your people with, I think that one's mishpat, with wise judgment. Anyone can check which they are, but in those first two verses, it's a combination of tzedek and mishpat. And then it says in verse 3, may the land enjoy shalom, is the next word in the Hebrew. May the land enjoy shalom, and may it experience tzedakah. May the king judge, it says judge the poor, but what it means judge for the poor, with justice. May he help the needy and defeat their oppressors. Now here, I refer to that passage because mishpat, judgment in court, and tzedek or tzedakah, justice in a wider sense, they are in a sense the preconditions for the possibility of shalom. Now, fascinatingly, in this translation, the Good News Bible, shalom, is translated prosperity. I think that is a poor translation of the word prosperity. In the NIV translation, I believe it is translated peace and prosperity. And this is by way of introducing this concept in the Hebrew scriptures of shalom, which I think is central to trying to understand the concept of the common good. Now, one traditional translation of shalom is simply peace. Peace can have a minimal meaning. It can mean the absence of conflict and not more than that. But it can also have a fuller meaning, which is about quality of relationship and blessing in relationship, individual or personal relationships or wider relationships. And I think there we're getting closer to the proper meaning of shalom It's also often been translated as welfare or well-being, and this would therefore be, may the land therefore in the light of Mishpat and Tzedek enjoy welfare or well-being. But the word is shalom, and I suggest that the term the common good is often as good a translation of the Hebrew word shalom as any other single English term. I'd like to refer, before we move into what the term sort of means conceptually, to one other passage in the Old Testament. Obviously the term shalom appears multiple times, but the other passage I refer to is a very, very famous one. It's in the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the prophet of doom. As you might know, many people will know, he lived in the later part of the kingdom of Judah, and his prophetic message was that disaster is coming. The Babylonians are going to come. They are going to overwhelm the city of Jerusalem and the land of Judah, and we will be conquered. That was not a popular message. It was an extremely bad news message. And then the disaster did happen. The Babylonians came, the city was destroyed, and many of the leaders of the people and many of the people were taken off in exile to Babylon, the capital city of the enemy empire. That's where they were taken to. Then one of the most astonishing things in the book of Jeremiah is what Jeremiah then does. Because after the disaster that he has been prophesying, famously he writes a letter from Jerusalem to the exiles in Babylon. And this is a very famous passage in Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, among the enemy people. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, etc. Seek the shalom of the city into which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because literally in its shalom is your shalom. This is completely extraordinary, because shalom is the Hebrew word. You could say that the people of Judah, you could say they recognized that God would give them shalom in Judah and Jerusalem. This was their shared good. And Jeremiah is saying the city of Babylon, the enemy city, it has its own shalom, and you are to seek it as aliens and exiles in it. And I think here we get a sense of the way in which this term shalom can helpfully be translated as the common good. Because I think a fair translation of this famous verse is, seek the common good of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because in its common good is your common good. So I've referred to these two biblical passages as a source for thinking about the concept of the common good in the scriptures. Various writers in recent decades have seen in this model, as it were, of the people of Judah in exile in Babylon, a model of the church, the Christian churches in very secularized Western societies. We may explore that a little bit later. I think it's one helpful model. It's not the only model. So among a number of other concepts that we can draw from Scripture, the concept of lordship. Jesus has very challenging things to say about authority and lordship. Even the concept of dominion in Genesis chapter 1, a concept that has been found difficult in recent decades. I find it less difficult than some do, in fact, because it's saying God has given us responsibility in his good, indeed very good creation, to exercise an appropriate authority in it, which means take care of it. And we're screwing up. So I think there are a number of concepts that we can draw from the scriptures to inform a Christian political thought, and the concept of the common good is one such concept. And I think the Hebrew concept of shalom, more than any other single term in the scriptures, can inform what we have to say about the common good. So, the concept itself, let's look at what it means. Now, I want to use an analogy here. I think this is a helpful analogy. Do either of you sing?
No, I'm a terrible singer.
Well, I mean, we both do sing.
You do sing.
We sing every morning for morning prayers.
We sing prayers, songs for prayers, but we're not singers.
You don't sing in a choir then? So
We've seen choirs.
you've seen choirs, yes. Have you attended concerts
Yeah.
where any sort of choir, maybe a gospel choir or a classical choir or any other sort of choir has been singing?
We attended the Vic University choir of all the music students when they were singing at the King's coronation earlier this year, actually, just by
How extraordinary.
chance. Yep.
So, we're going to think for a moment about different ways in which we do things together. Think about a choir singing. Different people are each doing their own thing, they're doing different things, and what is generated is a good, the music, that can only come to exist if they each do their different thing. They each sing their particular part in the choir. And so it's a good example of where people are coming together, doing different things to generate a good, a kind of good that could not exist for them or for anyone else, those listening, unless they did those different things together. And they have to sing their particular parts as well as they possibly can. And as they do that, the good for each of them and for anybody listening is being generated precisely simultaneously as when it is being enjoyed. So the generation and the enjoyment of the good are during the same time period, so to speak, because it is being generated by the singing of the different parts, and it is being enjoyed and appreciated both by the singers and by anyone listening at the same time. So let's contrast that reason why we do things together with another reason why we do things together. Here in Wellington, a lot of people are working in offices, and they may have a lunch break. And because they missed their alarm this morning, they didn't bring any lunch with them, and so they need to go out into the city and they need to find some kind of shop that sells something that they'd like to eat. So at lunchtime they come out of their offices, and I used to work once for a few months in an office in Wellington, and I would go out sometimes and I would buy a sandwich or something to have my lunch. Think about the sandwich stall or the sandwich shop. You go there, it's a collective activity. There's a queue. You've got people making the sandwiches, you've got people serving behind the counter. You go there to come away with a physical thing, your lunch, and then you eat it. And you could have made it yourself. In fact, this morning I made a sandwich, which is in my bag, so I'm not going to go to the sandwich stall today, but people do. Now, the shared activity of that has the purpose of generating an outcome which you benefit from later, eating the sandwich. Similarly, people work together to build a house. Obviously, you could build a house, I could build a house, it would be a pretty bad house. But if we work together and if we've developed the relative skills, a skilled builder could build a house by themselves, but they'd still build usually a better house working with other people, certainly a larger building. But the point there is the later outcome, because you've got a house. If you think about the choir singing, thinking about live music, there is no later outcome. It's happened. The good has happened simultaneously with its generation. If we think about the sandwich stall or building the house, the collective activity is instrumental. This is the point. You go to the sandwich stall with the instrumental goal. It's convenient. It's efficient. Somebody's making it for me. I can get it quickly. It's an instrumental task which gets me my later result. And I think that we can distinguish two kinds of collective activity, two kinds of shared activity there, which are actually quite profoundly different. On one hand, you have the kinds of activity that are like the choir, where the good lies in the shared activity itself. The very shared action itself is the good in question. And then you have the other kind of shared activity, where the shared activity is instrumental and the good lies in the outcome that you take away from it at the end, living in the house, eating the sandwich. Now, I've laboured that a bit. There are other kinds of good that are like the choir. Any form of team sport is like the choir. And think about a huge rugby match or a huge soccer match or a huge cricket match. The crowd is as much part of the inherently shared activity, where the good lies in being there, whether on the pitch or in the crowd. It's like the choir. So is a party, a decent party at any rate, is something that Christmas dinner, I think, is a good example, where you gather with your loved ones. And you don't have Christmas dinner simply because it's good food. Christmas dinner wouldn't be the same if you each ate it in your own bedroom, would it? It's because it's inherently shared. So I've distinguished there two kinds of reason why we do things together. Now, the point is that when we come to talk about the common good, we are talking about only one of those kinds of reasons for doing things together. We could call the singing of a choir, the playing of an orchestra, the live sport, being at a live sport event, a team game, we could call those micro common goods. They're inherently common goods. They are, to use a term from the philosopher Charles Taylor, who I'm very influenced on this, they are irreducibly common goods, because they cannot be reduced to what each individual could do or benefit from by themselves. It's no good singing your musical part or playing your musical instrument in your own room. You cannot generate the common good through doing that. They are irreducibly common goods on a micro scale. And so by way of analogy, when we come to think about the meaning of the common good, in a macro sense, the common good that we can attribute to a wider social group, part of the inherent meaning of the concept is that we are talking about an irreducibly common good, something that is generated as we participate in the life of the wider life of the social good itself. So when we come to think about wider social groups, they can also be understood in people's mindsets more like the sandwich bar. We participate in society to go and get something out of it that we want for our own private benefit, but that is merely instrumental. Our participation in wider society on that view is merely instrumental. Whereas the concept of the common good rejects that, and it says that the common good of wider social groups is inherently shared. It is generated as we participate together in its generation. So by way of counterexample in relation to the sandwich stall, people buy their sandwiches and then they go and sit on a nice day like today in one of those parks down there, and there's a nice atmosphere and maybe there's a live musician and you have a really nice shared activity in your lunchtime. Therefore an inherently common good is being generated for the people who've bought their sandwiches for instrumental reasons from the sandwich bar. So in fact there are many kinds of inherently common goods or irreducibly common goods that we do enjoy, and they can give us a way into thinking about the common good as a whole. So I've laboured that contrast a bit, but I think it's worth continuing to reflect on it. Let me just say one other thing about the sources of this idea of the common good. This will be very brief. I've referred to some biblical sources, but the concept of the common good in Western political thought has a number of other very significant sources as well. It goes right back to the ancient Greeks, not least Aristotle. Some people see Aristotle as it were, the father of the concept of the common good, although the reality of the so-called common good in Aristotle's politics is in fact a very flawed common good, because for him the common good that is generated by the free citizens in the life of the city together is not one that is open either to women or slaves. So, but nevertheless, the conceptuality of the common good owes a lot to Aristotle. It owes a lot to other ancient thinkers as well. In the Christian era, the most influential figure of the early Christian centuries came to be St. Augustine of Hippo, and in his great work called The City of God, seen as an immensely important source for later Christian political thought in Book 19 of that great work. In fact, he is examining the question, what is the human good? What does proper human living consist in? What is it? And under that heading, the specific question that he is most interested in and devotes a larger proportion of Book 19 to than any other question is the human good a social good? In other words, is it inherently a common good? And his very emphatic answer is yes, it is. And then there are several chapters that expound that answer, and that is a text that is very well worth spending time with. And then I think, because of the background in Scripture and in ancient Greek political thought, given the sort of collisions and combinations of ancient Greek and Roman political thought with the biblical Christian tradition in Western societies, I think that the concept of the common good just became part of the staple of the Western mindset, if I can put it in an oversimplistic way like that, for many centuries. It finds explicit articulation in St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century and carries right through till after the Reformation. So I think you can read Luther and Calvin and still see a presumption of the meaning of the common good that has a very long history. And this would be a view shared by quite a number of writers, probably including Charles Taylor. It's in the modern period of Western history, dated roughly from about the 17th century onwards, and in particular from the writings of Thomas Hobbes onwards, during which the older concept of the common good, whether drawn from biblical sources or from ancient Greek and Roman sources, classical sources in that sense, has just kind of disappeared from view. And I think that you can make a pretty strong argument that in most of the major contributors to Western political thought since about the middle of the 17th century, at least those ones that tend to be studied, while there are certain rearticulations of certain versions of a common good, in Rousseau, for example, it remains profoundly different from the earlier classical or Christian conceptions in ways that we haven't got the time to explore here. No. So I wanted to say a little bit more in that way about some of the sources of the concept of the common good. And then I want to come on and I want to point to 3 claims about the common good. And the first claim is the biggest, and it's the most important, and I think it can be, for some people, life-changing. Okay, and the big claim is this: the human good, the good for human beings, for us, for all human beings, the good life, human fulfillment, however you want to articulate it, human flourishing, is found in the common good, inherently. And it is found, the Christian gospel affirms, it is found in the irreducibly common good that is generated by the life of the Christian church, or should be, in Christian community, so that it is in participating in that life, playing our particular part, or singing our particular part, with everyone else singing their particular part, that we generate an irreducibly common good in which we find our own good. St. Paul famously uses the analogy of the body in his letters, especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, which is a completely extraordinary chapter, well worth studying in detail, not least for the ways in which he gives special place to the unrespectable people within the body of Christ. So our human good, according to the gospel, is found in the common good that should be generated in the Christian community by the work of the Holy Spirit among us, with the different gifts and abilities that the Holy Spirit gives us, according to St. Paul, again in that chapter. But the claim is an even bigger one than that our human good, the good for each of us, the good life for each of us, human fulfillment for each of us, is found in the common good of the wider society too, in participating in that and in helping to generate it through our shared participation in the multiple activities that do generate the common good of the wider society. That is where we find our human good. Now, some people hearing that may say, well, that's a statement of the obvious, I've always thought that. But other people responding to that might say, I don't really understand that point. And other people might say, well, I don't think that. That's not how I see things. And the reason why that is a contested claim is another big reason. And that is because in modern Western cultures, and again, this is a very broad claim, since about the 17th century, there have emerged a number of varieties of individualism. And in those varieties of individualism, the claim that the human good is found in the common good is self-consciously or not, rejected. What do I mean by individualism? What I mean by individualism is the view that is the opposite of the common good view, namely that the good life for each of us, human fulfillment, living the best possible life we can be found for you or for me or for whoever might be listening to this, irrespective of whether anybody else also enjoys the good life at the same time. There have been 3 strands of individualism which have formed our culture. Think of 3 upside-down ice cream cones as representing sort of development through the last few centuries of Western history, from the top to the bottom. So if the ice cream cones are underneath, and if we think about the 17th century as at the top and the 21st century as at the bottom, there are 3 varieties of individualism especially which have formed our culture, and they have been massively influential. The first one can be given the label hedonism, from the Greek word from pleasure, and if you read Thomas Hobbes, he is completely explicit in his conception of humanness that human beings are driven by desire or appetite for pleasure and the absence of pain. So you find what can be called a hedonistic anthropology in Thomas Hobbes, and you find there one of the main sources for an explicitly individualistic conception of humanness, because on that view of humanness, if you or I have managed to secure for ourselves the most pleasurable life we can, which avoids pain, then we have the good life, irrespective of whether anybody else has it. So that view is inherently individualistic in that sense. And so there is, on that approach, a rejection of the older concept of the common good. And so a Hobbesian hedonistic conception of humanness is one of the upside-down ice cream cones. That ice cream cone shape, because it started with Hobbes in that case, and then its influence extended widely to form modern and indeed continuingly postmodern Western culture. The second strand can be called voluntarism, from the Latin word for will, which is voluntas. And the person at the top of the second cone, more than anyone, is probably the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose work is difficult and complex. And I am not meaning to attribute the view that I'm going to summarise now directly to Kant, but he inspired a whole way of thinking about humanness, which emphasises the priority of individual free will. Individual free will. So very famously, I think it's the first sentence of his book called The Groundwork for a Metaphysic of Morals, is something like, the only thing in the world that can be said to be good in itself is a free will, or words to that effect. And in Kant's philosophy, Kant reacted against the Hobbesian view. He said we're not just driven by de facto desires or appetites that we happen to have. There's this deeper capacity to exercise freedom. Each individual has this capacity to exercise freedom, free will, and to do so individually. And this generates, more popularly, a different way of thinking about human beings, where the definitive thing in what makes for the human good is the exercise of individual free will. So, as I say, to sort of popularise that idea, to put it more accessibly, if you live a life or I live a life which is one of pursuit of particular projects that I have freely chosen to pursue, then that is the good life for me. So that might include a career that I, as a matter of free will, have chosen to pursue, and certain leisure pursuits that I have chosen to pursue, freely exercising my free will, and certain relationships that I have freely chosen to enter, exercising my free will. And if I live that life of freely chosen projects of various sorts, then there's a sense in which I am living a life that, in one view, corresponds to the emphasis on individual free will that descends from Immanuel Kant. And within the Western tradition, for any of you might have studied John Rawls, for example, in your degree. So John Rawls, very self-consciously in his work A Theory of Justice, is criticising the utilitarian tradition. the utilitarian tradition comes within the Hobbesian upside-down cone. And Rawls was criticising that from a more Kantian position, which emphasises rights. And so you get this contrast between a sort of hedonist-inspired utilitarian conception, which then also comes to include Adam Smith's way of seeing the world and the emergence of the celebration of what is possible through markets where people bring their desires for pleasure to a place where they can exchange goods and services with each other to all of them gain greater pleasure through their transactions. So that's one of the cones. And the second cone is one where there's an emphasis not just on maximising pleasure and minimising pain, but exercising free will. But that generates a second form of individualism, because if you or I are living a life in which we are pursuing our individually freely chosen projects, and if we do so successfully, then we are each living the good life, and it doesn't matter inherently to me whether you are. And then there is a third form of individualism too, and this is the third cone, and a source for this is, for all he said in his voluminous and challenging writings, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a source for this. This is the view that Charles Taylor, I think, has been influential in labelling expressivism, where in an individualistic conception of expressivism, the good life is conceived of as to give expression to what one finds within oneself is unique to oneself. And through that self-expression, to be able to come to a point of self-realisation as a human person. And in Rousseau, in his book The Social Contract, and probably in Émile as well, there's this idea that the original individual human person is pure and good, and they are corrupted by society. And so what we need is social change that will enable the original and good human person to be able to express their humanness again without the distortions and the corruptions that society inflicts upon them. And that gives rise to the idea that the good life lies in true self-expression of what one finds within one's self. And I think that is open to a number of interpretations, some of which allow for the possibility of an inherently common good. The self-expression becomes something that is inherently in common with others. But in our broader culture, there's certainly come to be an individualistic version of that expressivism, which I think has become especially influential in recent decades. And one can trace some of the roots of how that has come to be the case, where self-expression, including not least sexual self-expression, has come to be seen as almost the good that defines the human good for people. And so I think that one can envisage that as a third cone that generates a third kind of individualism. And I think it is individualistic in the same sort of way, because if I have managed to live a life in which I have been able to express myself as the unique and individual person that I have found myself to be by looking within myself, then it doesn't matter in principle whether you've managed to do that. And so I think there are those three strands of individualism which have come to be very influential culturally, and at least in the forms that I have roughly outlined them there, none of them sees the human good as lying inherently in the common good of the wider society. Instead, wider society is seen as a kind of arena that I enter, in principle instrumentally, to enable me either to maximise my pleasure or minimise my pain, in the case of hedonism, or to pursue my individually freely willed projects, or to enable me to achieve greater self-expression. And that this can seem a harsh view, but in principle, all of the relationships that people have, if their mindsets really are driven by one or other of those forms of individualism, all of their relationships, all of their engagements with social groups and workplaces and even personal relationships are ultimately instrumentally driven. Let me qualify that straight away, because I don't think many people at all, in fact, in their lives, are driven solely by any of those forms of individualism. in fact, it's amazing that in a culture that has been significantly formed by those kinds of individuals, and it's clear that most people, everybody pretty much, does continue to value a wide range of irreducibly common micro goods at least. So we really do value singing in choirs, and we really do value playing team sports and going to see the All Blacks or going to see whoever it might be that we're going to see. We do value going to concerts. We do value our family relationships for what they are, not just because of what we can get out of them as individuals. We do all value many micro common goods in a way that the forms of individualism that form our culture barely justify. So the older concept of the common good that comes from biblical roots and classical political philosophy has been deeply and extensively challenged in the whole of the modern period of Western history by these versions of individualism. And so that's why the issue we're looking at today is very, very contested. And of course, one of the challenges that those who are inclined to embrace one of those forms of individualism will very quickly make against anyone who advocates that the traditional concept of the common good, that our human good is found in the common good. They will say that is bound to restrict individual freedom, because what will happen is that will come to be associated with some kind of politics that proves to be authoritarian and seeks to generate across a society the common good in ways that people no longer have freedom to dissent from. And in fact, it is the case, you could call the traditional conception of the common good has been associated with a number of highly authoritarian forms of politics. And that was the case historically, and it has continued to be, where there have been revivals of the idea of the common good, certain, I would say, probably distorted conceptions of the common good in the modern period. They have often been associated with highly authoritarian forms of politics. And so sometimes, often there will be immediately a pushback against the concept of the common good because it will be seen to be potentially inherently controversial. Now, I want to affirm a proper conception of the common good of the wider society emphasises that it can only come to exist freely, as people freely engage in the wide range of activities that generate it. It's not something that can be generated from an authoritarian political centre, and attempts to do that from such a centre will fail, because what will be generated won't be the common good, it will be to a significant extent the common bad, as it were, because people will be oppressed in various ways. But that is a big area of debate. So all of that was under the first claim I want to make about the concept of the common good, which is the big claim, the really important one, that the human good is found in the common good for each and all of us. I shall add one autobiographical addendum on that. I feel very strongly about that point, because this is very personal. I was a Christian as a young person. When I was about 30, I went through a period where my Christian faith had evaporated. I used that analogy at the time. It felt appropriate. It still makes sense to me. It just wasn't there anymore. And that was an interesting period. It was when I was doing postgraduate study. That was helpful, because I read a lot, which helped me. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that what brought me back unexpectedly and suddenly to finding I had Christian faith again was the insight that the human good is found in the common good. And it did that because at the same time I came to realise that the Christianity I had had in my earlier life until then had been, despite everything we can read in the scriptures, it had been at a very profound level individualistic. So individual personal relationship with God comes first. And while I always found it difficult to understand what was meant by personal relationship with God, to be honest, that comes first, and everything else, including participation in the life of the church, was in some sense secondary. If somebody had asked me whether I thought that back then, I probably wouldn't have recognised that that's how I thought. But I had been a very committed Christian, involved in churches, doing all sorts of things. And I came to realise in a particular moment, and the moment came through observing one other person's life, I suddenly realised that they had understood something that I hadn't understood, because they lived their life in a way that drew on the common good all the time, as well as generating it. And I sort of realised that all my Christian commitment somehow was real, but it was coming from a place where it was all secondary to what really mattered, which was relationship with God. But in fact, a proper reading of St. Paul, as well as the rest of the scriptures, makes it abundantly plain that in Christian faith, participation in the life of the community in Christ, which is a corporate term, is completely inseparable from whatever we can say about relationship with God. We are in relationship with God together, or not at all, in principle. And I came to that insight way too late, but in a way that has stuck with me since. I hope that little autobiographical bit makes some sense, yes.
When you were talking about these three strands, my thoughts immediately went to Rousseau and the social contract, and wondering if that might be seen by some as a replacement of the common good.
Yes. I mean, Rousseau's book, The Social Contract, is brilliant. It is so exceptionally clear in the argument it makes. It's also mercifully short, which always helps.
I'm quite partial to Rousseau myself. Really.
You're partial to Rousseau?
But in some ways.
In some ways, okay.
Yeah, not that I would agree with everything.
So undoubtedly, the conception of the good life that Rousseau articulates in that book is a conception of the common good. Undoubtedly. But it is not the same as the earlier classical or Christian conception of the common good. And the way in which it is different is that the concept of will is completely central to it. And famously, his term is the general will. And so you get the same emphasis on the term will in Rousseau as you get in Kant. And you could say that Rousseau is Kant transformed into a certain conception of the common good where will is central. So, Rousseau is kind of Hobbes plus Kant. It is a reaction both against Hobbes and Kant in different ways. So, like Hobbes, Rousseau recognised that people will naturally be in conflict with one another as they seek to exercise free will. And for Rousseau, the solution lies, not as it did for Hobbes, in the establishment of a hugely authoritarian government to establish a kind of minimal peace, which gives us a chance of satisfying our desires for pleasure. But for Rousseau, it involves coming together and exercising our individual free wills together through a form of direct democracy. And it is as we will together that a genuinely common good is generated. It also happens to be a very authoritarian one. He explicitly uses the phrase that some will be forced to be free. The good remains the free will. It's just the freedom of the general will. It remains the free will as it is in Kant, but it is now the general will. It is an inherently or irreducibly common good, but it is a good of shared will, not a good that has an inherent connection with. But in the classical conception, the older conception of the common good, it is inherently bound up with a substantive conception of human nature. Real human natures find fulfillment in the common good, in the ancient conception, the pre-modern conception. But I think in the Rousseauian conception, that link has been broken. And Rousseau is distinctly modern because the emphasis is on general will, and that's what generates the common good. Therefore, in Rousseau, we get a kind of communitarian voluntarism. Kant inspires an individualistic voluntarism, and in Rousseau we get a communitarian voluntarism. We can say a kind of common good voluntarism. So yes, one finds a version of the common good in Rousseau, but I don't think it's a convincing conception of the common good in the end. That's what I would say.
I have one other question, but you might cover it later. One of the reasons why I like Rousseau is because there's a particular Dutch historian who I quite like, who Rayne has heard me talk about lots, who uses Rousseau and talks about if we change the way that we view humanity from the sort of Hobbesian individualism to a view where we believe that people have the capacity to generally, in most cases, be decent, and if we restructure our society somehow, then that would lead to a better life for everyone. So one example that springs to mind is prisons, for example. The way that our whole prison system is set up at the moment, sort of based on this conception that people need to be locked away and there's no redemption possible, and that's not built into... the American prison system springs to mind, but in New Zealand as well, certainly. But there's other ways that prisons have been done in other countries where it's much more about a focus of community and rehabilitation and bringing people into the community, because the base belief is that people are redeemable and there is such thing as second chances and is such thing as working together for that common good. So you're talking about the common good being something you join in with freely, but to join in with something like that freely you need some degree of resources and time to participate in, even like to go to a concert, for example, or a sports game. You need money and time as just two sort of base things. And this Dutch philosopher proposes a universal basic income as a way to address some of those things, but there's a variety of different ways. So my question is about how the common good can include people who might be poor or oppressed by the current system. How would sort of we make some of those reforms and changes to our current political and economic and social order?
Okay, and the name of the Dutch writer is?
Rutger Bregman.
Yes. I have, only because I listened to one of the other podcasts.
Where I talked about him.
Yes, and you did, and I looked him up, and it looks like an interesting book. So I have not read it, I've only learned about it recently. Yes, great range of issues you raised there. It's a bit of a cue into the second claim I want to make, actually, which is simply that societies can have a common good. This is a claim that not everyone has accepted. In fact, Marxists have not accepted it, except in the final eschatological age of the communist society. But until then, because societies are almost ontologically divided by class, there cannot be a common good. So a political or philosophical tradition that affirms that the human good is found in the common good and claims that society can have a common good is anti-Marxist in that respect. And likewise, on the other side of the political spectrum, let's give this example. Neoliberalism is a short form of neoclassical liberalism, the 19th century economic liberalism, associated with the advocacy of capitalism, which, as it was revived in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and so on, and has come to sort of dominate public policy discussion in various ways over most of the subsequent decades. Now, as I've already implied, that way of seeing things comes out of the Hobbesian hedonistic strand of individualistic Western thought, and on that view, society can't have a common good because there isn't actually such a thing as the common good. There are only individuals and the good that each of them can have, which essentially is maximising pleasure and minimising pain, or maximising utility, as that then came to be called, or achieving preferences, whatever their preference is for. So on that way of seeing the world, that there is no such thing as the common good. Societies don't have a common good. There are only individuals' goods. So the claim that societies can have a common good is a contested claim. It's a controversial claim. Now, in relation to the separate or the second point that you brought in, there's a great point to bring in, and I wanted to comment on this. That is to say, people who may not be able, people who are in circumstances where they find they cannot participate. They cannot participate in helping to generate the common good because they don't have the means, because they are in some sense excluded from participation through poverty, simply lack of income, or for some other reason. Now, I think that the sort of vision of the common good enables us to see the issue here in a distinctive way. It matters very, very much that everyone can be enabled to have social conditions so that they can participate, because otherwise none of us will have the common good. because their contribution with their particular gifts and abilities is as important as anyone else's. So when there are people who, for whatever combination of reasons, aren't able to participate in the society in the way that generates the common good, we are all the worse for it. And of course, for their sake, as the particular people they are, we need to make sure that public policy and all sorts of other initiatives that might be necessary are taken to enable them to have what they need, not just so that they can live a minimally decent human life, which of course we want everybody to be able to live, but so that they can then participate in the wider society in ways that draw on their gifts and abilities and generate the common good. Because if they don't have the common good, if they can't participate, then to that extent the common good is defective, is flawed, is incomplete. Of course, in fact, in real human societies afflicted by all sorts of problems, the common good, in a sense, represents an ideal, and it will never be fully real. It can't be. But that doesn't mean we can't come closer towards it, that we can act in ways that generate more of a common good than less of a common good. And so we should. So I think it is incredibly... The vision of the common good, the vision that the human good is found in the common good, actually gives us a distinctive reason for seeking to make sure that those people who find that they cannot participate are able to participate, have the social conditions that enable that to happen.
I guess the obvious flow-on question from that is what are the conditions politically, socially, economically that we should structure society by? So, but we can do your third claim first.
I think we need to do the third claim first. So the third claim does take us to practice, and it relates to your question, and it's this. It's the claim that the main way in which the common good comes to exist in a society, and I think this is an aside right at this point, but we can speak about the common good of a small local community, we can speak about the common good of a big town, we can speak about the common good of a city, the city of Wellington, we can speak about the common good of a nation. As some contributors in this field think that the common good perhaps can't be applied to a very big community like a large nation state. I'm not convinced of that. I think it can be. So we can speak of the common good in relation to a range of different sizes of human community. But in any of those, the main way that the common good is in fact generated is through our ordinary day-to-day jobs, the work we do when we get up in the morning and go to work. That is how we generate the common good, because it is through people working in companies making goods and services that benefit everybody else. It is through people working in public service agencies of various sorts. It is through people working in charitable organisations of various sorts, third sector agencies. It is through their work and through what you and I and everybody does as we go to work in those places. That is the main way that the common good in society is generated. It's not the only way, obviously. The common good is also generated through all the things we do with our leisure time, too. It's generated through all other forms of human relationship, family life, marriages, friendships, other groups that we're part of. In emphasising that the main way that the human good is generated is through our ordinary daily jobs, here I am influenced especially by one emphasis in Catholic social teaching, which I referred to just now. And for those who know nothing about Catholic social teaching, the usual meaning that is taken from that term is a body of probably now about 20 major documents that have been issued by the Roman Catholic Church in the names of the popes of the day since a particularly influential document in 1891 called Rerum Novarum. All the documents have Latin titles. And those documents set out a conception of society and of how to order societies in ways that avoid some of the mistakes that one finds in socialism and one finds in capitalism. And in that body of documents, from the first one, there has been a very strong emphasis on human work, the importance of human work in human lives, and the importance of ensuring proper conditions for workers. And there was an advocacy in the very first document of the importance of distinctly Catholic trade unions. That document was published in the context of the crisis of industrial capitalism that emerged in European societies after the Industrial Revolution, and the appalling circumstances in which a lot of workers found themselves in that time, 1891, the later part of the 19th century. Human work has been probably the main theme in those documents. And in 1981, not 1891, but 1981, the then Pope, Pope John Paul II, a very great figure, brought up under communism in Poland, the first Pope for many centuries who was not Italian. Extraordinary that the Roman Catholic Church, by the grace of God, chose a Pope from a communist country at that time in the Cold War. John Paul II, when he went into the conclave, which is the meeting which chooses a pope, among the reading material he took in was a Marxist philosophy journal. I think that's very, very amusing somehow. But in Marxism, there's a strong emphasis on human work. And in John Paul, in the document he published in 1981 called Laborem Exercens, he articulates an incredibly impressive argument in which human work is given even greater significance in human living than it had already been articulated as having in that tradition of thought. John Paul interprets what it is that we are made in God's image and given dominion in the world. He interprets that as fulfilled to a large extent through ordinary human work. And that human work is for the person, so it is through working in appropriate circumstances with the rights of workers being respected and so on, and in good conditions, it's through human work that to a large extent we find our fulfilment. So as people are able to have ordinary human work in which their gifts and abilities can be developed, and that they can find fulfilment for themselves, partial fulfilment for themselves through that. It's through that wide range of forms of human work. And John Paul in that document defines human work very, very broadly. Some people find it so broadly that it's almost meaningless, but I think it's very self-conscious on his part. So it includes in his conception bringing up children, for example. Through those wide forms of human work, if people do them well, then the common good is generated. There then has to be a really important qualification on this third claim. The third claim is simply that the main way the common good is generated is through ordinary human work. The claim is, as long as the institutions within which people work are properly ordered towards their proper purpose in the world. That sounds like a vague phrase. But there has come to be, in fact, in a body of Protestant, specifically Calvinistic thought that emerged in the Netherlands, associated with the figure of Abraham Kuyper, late 19th century, huge figure in Dutch public life, and also in Roman Catholic social teaching. There's come to be articulated this fascinating way of thinking of social institutions as of a number of distinct kinds. So think of businesses, schools, health services, the arts, and so on, a number of different spheres of society. And each of those spheres of society, the institutions within them, each kind of institution has its own proper vocational responsibility. And so it is supposed to order its activity around its vocational responsibility. And so to give a concrete example, and this takes us to the practice part, the practice of the common good, a very concrete example in the area we've touched on already, businesses. Coming out of the Hobbesian hedonist tradition that generated economic liberalism that then regenerated itself as what came to be called neoliberalism. You get this argument that the defining purpose of a private business is to maximise profit. And everything that a private business otherwise does should be determined by what will maximise profit. On this alternative view that I'm articulating that has emerged in these parts of the Christian tradition, that view is definitely wrong because it gets means and ends precisely reversed. Clearly, a private business has to make enough of a return to stay in business. And so making a profit, especially if the profit then can meet the reasonable expectations of investors and can perhaps be reinvested in the business too, is a necessary and good thing. But the primary purpose of a private business is to make goods and services. i.e. to make things that benefit people, to offer services that benefit people. That's what it exists in the world for. And as such, private businesses are incredibly important social agencies. Look, we have books here, we have a microphone, we have mugs, we have a computer, we have couches. All these things are made by private businesses, and we are benefiting from all these things right now. And it's really important that they make good ones, make good sofas that are comfortable and don't ruin your back, and make good laptops and make good microphones that are going to pick up the sound relatively clearly. So these things, as done by the full range of private businesses, are incredibly important, and they exist to make good products and provide good services. Of course, they need to make a profit, but they do not exist merely to maximise profit. And I can send you a reference to a particular American academic who's focused on this. I can't remember her name right now. Therefore, putting it simply, the vocational responsibility of the social bodies that are within the sphere of society called private business, the specific vocational responsibility is to make goods that actually are good for people and provide services that actually serve people. That's simple, it's straightforward, but it precisely reverses the means and ends from the Milton Friedman perspective, which says actually what you provide, whether you supply cigarettes or broccoli or landmines or fruit juice, doesn't matter. What matters is that you maximise profit. And there, the good or service that you provide has been made entirely subject to the overriding objective of maximising profit. So the big qualification on the claim that it is through our ordinary jobs, our ordinary work, that we generate the common good, the huge qualification is, as long as the different kinds of institution that make up society are able to act in line with their proper vocational responsibility. If they fail to do that, and many do, then to that extent we are not going to generate the common good. We're going to generate something that falls far short of the common good and may be primary, and so the nature of society may come to be, for example, one in which the ideologies of individualism have come to dominate, and that's how people think, that's why they act, and that's what forms culture more than anything else, if you see what I mean. You're looking quizzical there.
I just have two questions, which I think you've resolved with your qualifier about work. Mm-hmm. The first, do you know who David Graeber is? He's an anthropologist.
I've heard the name, but I know nothing about him.
Mika has read his work more than I have, but he writes a lot about bullshit jobs and how work is not good in and of itself. And this, I think, relates to my second question, which was about the alienation of labour, which is a Marx concept. And I'm just wondering, you seem to say that work produces the common good in and of itself, but I was wondering how you would deal with those two concepts.
Yes, okay. The short answer is read the document by John Paul II called Labor et Exercens. It's not an easy read. It's a short-ish document, but it makes what I find, I've read it very closely, it makes a profoundly incisive argument, both against Marxist socialism and against liberal capitalism. And it says both got human work wrong. He says the key to the whole social question, that was a phrase that was widely used in kind of Catholic discussions, the social question. The key to the whole social question is human work. And in modern societies, by which he meant sort of modern Western societies, we have got it terribly wrong. He grew up under that system. He knew it inside out. He would not disagree at all with the kind of Marxist claim that, in fact, a huge amount of human labour has been deeply alienating people from what I think Marx called their species being, which amounts to the same thing as saying that the working conditions in which people were forced to work found themselves forced to work under industrial capitalism was completely not conducive to their human good. I think that there is no denying the extent to which, in fact, in capitalist societies, much human work has been deeply alienating, and in fact still is. It still is. And what was the other side of your question?
Graeber's bullshit jobs.
That concept is kind of that. There are people, and some surveys say 37 to 40% of people work in a job that they themselves and the majorities of the industries that they work in don't see as contributing any good or value to society, to the point where they feel as if their job didn't exist, society would be better off. Often society would either not notice or be better off. He cites things like industries like banking, consultancy, vast amounts of advertising. And then he also talks about this cultural ethos of we should get meaning from our work, and so people feel almost spiritually drained and destroyed from the fact that they are completely unable to do that because they see their job and their work as meaningless. And often those jobs, he says, are the ones that pay really well. And then the jobs like teachers, nurses, public transport workers are jobs that pay in comparison far, far poorly, when those people who work those jobs feel like they're deeply meaningful and feel like they're contributing something really important to society.
Okay, that's all completely fascinating. No, it really is. If I go back to John Paul II, his argument, and my third claim that the common good is primarily generated through people doing their ordinary jobs, that is not meant to be, as it were, a small conservative claim. It's not saying things are as they need to be now in the societies with the kinds of jobs we currently have. In the John Paul II perspective, there's this strong emphasis that, in fact, human work should be for the person in all kinds of institution. So you could translate that by saying bullshit jobs should not exist. There needs to be radical changes in the workplace and the way companies are conceived of, which enable people then to come to see meaning in their work. You know, I think that the irony here is so striking. In those extremely well-paid jobs, you know, the City of London is one of the world centres of finance, etc., etc. The word that is used for people who get paid vast sums of money is compensation. You know, this is always a bit amusing. In fact, I think it's quite amusing. They don't talk about salary or wages. What they get is compensation. Compensation for selling their souls. There is no compensation big enough for selling your soul.
And that's, like, Graeber also says that there's sort of this idea that we should pay people who work as teachers and nurses less because they need less because they derive meaning from their work, whereas other people need to be compensated because their work is meaningless.
Well, here's a big change that is needed. Clearly, dealing with investment finance is a really important thing to do. It's a really good thing to do. We need investments in companies that are going to make good things that benefit people and provide good services which benefit people. So to work in investment finance is an excellent thing to do. The trouble is that whole world has come to be captured by the individualism of neoliberalism. And that is a false way of seeing the world. And on that view, you only do your job for what you take out of it individually. And if you seem to put a lot into it, even your soul, then you feel you should take a lot out of it individually, which you can spend on your private life. So you have fantastic houses and fantastic boats and fantastic holidays, and you have all that. And that's because there's a sense in which you've put in so much. It's a conception of justice based on individual contribution. And if you feel you've made a big contribution, then as a matter of justice, you should take out a lot. Whereas when you come to schools, it's such a good example because, you know, teaching can be a very fulfilling way of spending one's time. So people find fulfilment in the activity itself. Part of the reward comes from the participation. So there's a sense in which you don't feel you need a vast amount of money, as long as you've got enough to live an okay life and to bring up your family, do the things that any human being could reasonably expect that they could do to live a moderately fulfilled life. As long as you've got enough for that, you've got enough, because your job itself is for you part of the good life. What's needed, therefore, is reform of the investment banks, not necessarily institutional reform, but reform of the way they are understood, what they are understood to be. You could have a common good investment bank. There is one in London. There's a body called the CCLA. I forget what it stands for. But it seeks to order all its investments towards the common good. And I dare say that people in that organisation are not paid the same as what some of the other people in the City of London. There are other examples too. So I think that this third claim is open to an interpretation which can answer those questions, and I've sort of suggested some of the ways in which that's possible. Now, we're getting on towards the end here, and I'm reminded by referring to CCLA of something that I wanted to mention. A few years ago, I did quite a lot of work for a body in the UK which is called Together for the Common Good. So we've spoken a bit about the practice of the common good in the world of business, and that it comes to exist through ordinary people doing their ordinary jobs, or can do. But of course, we live in very divided societies now, divided in various ways, not just divided sort of socio-economic, not just divided economically in terms of inequality, which clearly is the case. We've touched on the issues around that already. But in other ways, culturally, there are big cultural divides. And this body in the UK called Together for the Common Good has a very interesting background. The founder director is a woman called Jenny Sinclair, who is the daughter, as it happens, of somebody who used to be a very famous Anglican bishop in the United Kingdom called David Shepherd back in the 80s and 90s. He was the Bishop of Liverpool, an ex-industrial city in the northwest of England, which had huge social problems at the time. He came to work very closely with the Catholic Archbishop of Liverpool and with free church leaders in that city, and they formed a sort of joint Christian witness that looked outward and had a hugely significant role in helping Liverpool as a city to engage with its problems, which included sectarianism, Catholics, Protestants. There were a lot of Irish people in Liverpool, because just across the Irish Sea from Ireland. There were all sorts of social problems, race problems, riots involving black people, and huge social problems. And these church leaders came to be recognised and praised for the great role that they had. Jenny Sinclair, after her parents both died in the 2010s, she came to have this sense that there was a legacy of her father's work with the other church leaders that had something to offer to our time in the 2010s. And so she began this group called Together for the Common Good, which gained quite a lot of support quite quickly, because quite a lot of people could remember her father, the Bishop of Liverpool, the Anglican Bishop, and the other church leaders, and how much they contributed. And I mention that because they have a website. I have done some work for them. I'm not directly involved in them. In the context of work they've done, they've given a lot of attention to some of the practices that people from church communities and other faith communities can help to foster, to enable communication across social divides, the kinds of social divides that we now have. And I would just want to point people who might be listening to that body as one which has such resources. And they've done a lot of work in the kind of practices, the identifying of appropriate leaders, and how to listen to people and how to engage with people to enable communication where communication had not been taking place. Differences of age even. Some people say that Brexit was partly a sort of old versus young. There was among the other divisive issues that were there. I just wanted to point to that body as one source of real practical ways of engaging with some of the social divides that have come to characterise societies like the UK and like New Zealand, and also very, very seriously the United States, and no doubt other societies. And then a few words about the role of politics in all this. This is really, really important, and I thought it might be appropriate if we conclude with that issue.
Can I just ask one question about the economic and business side of things? So I know people who would argue that this idea of companies should serve the goods and services, that the best way to make companies make the best goods and services is to pursue the profit motive. So of course we have mass inequality, bullshit jobs, climate change. So clearly that doesn't quite work. Why? Why doesn't that quite work? What's wrong with the profit motive as a way to ideally guide the invisible hand of the market to make the best goods and services through competition and etc., etc.? What's broken about that?
Because it will always distort the outcomes. Because it gives an incentive to companies to create demand for things that are of no use, as long as they sell. It gives an incentive for built-in obsolescence, i.e. that light bulbs or whatever will only last X amount of years because they need to keep on selling light bulbs. It always gives a reason for minimising the wages you're going to pay, as long as you can get enough workers, it always distorts. It always reverses the proper ends and means of what business is about. Not to say that the profit motive cannot be an effective driver. And in a business which, this point is worth emphasising, but in a business that is properly ordered towards providing goods that will benefit people or services that will benefit people, of course, you're going to need the best accountants. You're going to need the best marketing people. You're going to need the people with the best entrepreneurial flair. Otherwise, your company will fold. Of course, any company that's going to be worth its salt in the marketplace is going to have to be an extremely good company as a company. Otherwise, it will go out of business. And we don't want companies going out of business unless they're producing stuff that's rubbish. And so all of the business skills that people, I take it, learn if they go to business school need to be brought to, as it were, good business practice in the full sense of good. And among those things, it's perfectly proper to be driven by recognition that you're going to have to make some money. We've had great sales today. Isn't that fantastic? I was, in fact, working in a small bookshop with a cafe before I came here for a while. That was the job I had for a while. And, I was always checking whether we'd sold many books or not. We didn't sell many books, actually, but the number of books that we sold went up while I was there. And that was very satisfying. I think it's perfectly proper to have that as a driving motivation. It just must not be the overriding objective of the whole business, because otherwise everything gets distorted.
That's a good answer.
That's a good answer, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, now to politics.
Encouraging.
To the government.
How can politics help?
Okay. So I identified earlier 3 kinds of individualism which have come to form our modern and postmodern Western culture extensively. I don't mean, through identifying those 3 strands of individualism as contrasted with a proper conception of the common good, I don't mean to condemn them completely. I think the proper Christian missionary approach to each of those strands of individualism is to reconnect them with Christian theological roots from which they were cut off. So in relation to the hedonist strand, which has generated economic liberalism and neoliberalism, etc., I think one of Charles Taylor's main points in his book, Sources of the Self, he makes the point that one of the effects of the Reformation, an outcome of the theology of the Reformation, is what he calls an affirmation of ordinary life, by which he meant the goods of so-called production and reproduction. Ordinary jobs. For Luther, your calling could be in any kind of job. Your vocation could be in any kind of job, not just to be a priest or a religious person, for Luther. The goods of ordinary production and reproduction, ordinary family life. There was a great affirmation of those through the Reformation, ordinary family life and ordinary working life. And Charles Taylor's argument is, in effect, that affirmation of ordinary life was put through the prism of the sort of 17th century scientific revolution, which we haven't talked about, and the shift from a sort of Aristotelian and medieval Christian way of seeing the world, in which the common good was a prominent concept. In the 17th century, with the beginnings of what came to be called modernity, in Thomas Hobbes and so on, there was a great sort of shift away from a way of seeing the world that had been dominant. And in that shift, the theological roots in the Reformation that justified the affirmation of the goods of production and reproduction, those theological roots were broken. And what you ended up with was hedonism, which is another version of the goods of ordinary life, ordinary pleasures, the things I happen to desire. Maximising pleasure and minimising pain is what human life is all about. Charles Taylor, in effect, argues that that was a secularised version of the Reformation's affirmation of ordinary life. And so even that strand of modernity, that ice cream cone, that came to exist in the way it did, having been cut off from theological roots that made sense of it, as it were, that made sense of the affirmation of ordinary life. The Reformation's affirmation of ordinary life made sense of a range of ordinary goods, which then, in a sense, ceased to make such sense after they had been cut off from those theological roots. One can make the same argument, a parallel argument, about the other 2 cones as well. So expressivism, Rousseauian, post-Rousseauian individualist expressivism, What does that connect with in Christian faith? It connects with Paul. St. Paul saying that we each have our distinctive gifts and we are to discern our distinctive gifts and give expression to our distinctive gifts for the sake of the common good. So those forms of individualism need to be reconnected with Christian theological roots from which they have been disconnected. I don't want to condemn those three strands of individualism, and nor do I want to condemn the features of modern Western societies that have reflected some of the things that the representatives of those strands of thought have emphasised. And they have emphasised individual freedoms in different senses of freedom. And so individual freedom has come to be seen to be the political good that most needs to be protected in the societies that we live in. And it is perfectly proper that modernity has come to recognise that point. And in the earlier periods of Western history, the vision of the common good tended to be associated with a vision of politics which had a very strong emphasis, in a way that was indebted to Aristotle particularly, on discipline. So the role of government through law came to be understood as to discipline people, which means train people essentially, in avoiding wrong conduct and in practicing right conduct, so that the human qualities we call virtues would be formed in people, and that would then enable them to live well and to live in ways that generate the common good. But that is quite an authoritarian conception, because it says the role of government is in effect a moral disciplinary role. It's a moral training kind of role. I think that conception of the role of government was always inherently problematic theologically. And you could see the whole of the emergence of modern Western societies as, to some extent, a justified escape from that authoritarianism and a recognition of the value of individual freedom, which poses the challenge, the very big challenge, of how, if my first claim earlier is in fact true, that the human good, the good for each of us, is found in the common good, how can we really generate that common good in ways that avoid authoritarian politics, that avoid a kind of politics which goes back to a kind of disciplinary view, which sees the role of government as about disciplining us so that we do the right thing that will generate the common good? And I think that the answer lies in conceiving of the role of government as not one of effecting a kind of moral training. I think the ministry of the word of the church, interpreting that very broadly, has a very big role there. But the role of government is to establish the conditions for the possibility of the common good, which itself then needs to be generated by people freely, as they recognise that their good will exist in the common good, and then they are able to orientate their lives in ways such that they work in their workplaces and they conduct their family relationships and their friendships in ways that generate genuine common goods and the overall common good, rather than, say, in narrowly individualistic ways, which tend in the end to generate various kinds of inequalities and conflicts in societies. So the role of government is a kind of enabling role. It's a role of establishing the necessary conditions, a range of social conditions that are needed for each person to have the possibility of making their own free contribution to the common good through the various kinds of social bodies that they are members of or that they participate in. So that's how I would see the role of government.
Do you have any examples of policies, programs, or public policy decisions which might foster that common good?
Let's think about working life a little bit more. Clearly, human beings at work need to be able to work in conditions that are safe, that are healthy, and they need to be able to receive wages that are enough to meet their needs. They need to be able to have rest. They need not to work an excessive number of hours in any one day or in any one week. They need to have holidays. I think if you're an employer, in principle, you have a moral responsibility to ensure all those things for your workers. But to the extent that, in fact, employers don't, it is perfectly properly the role of government to ensure that there is law that guarantees a range of working conditions that are conducive to enabling workers to be properly human in the workplace. And so that seems to me to be a good example that fits under the heading of establishing conditions for the possibility of the common good.
I think there is, in what you've articulated about the common good, quite a useful set of principles to think about and apply to policies and legislation and what governments advocate for and seek to do. One example that sprung to mind when you were talking about workers and all of the conditions for workers is that our government that we just had brought in a piece of legislation called the Fair Pay Act or something like that, and it allowed for fair pay agreements, which was essentially a form of industry-wide collective bargaining. I've worked in all manner of lower paying jobs, and the one that I'm working in at the moment is the only one that I've ever joined a collective agreement, collective contract, and it's by far the best job in terms of how I'm paid and how I'm treated and how I'm looked after that I have ever had. And even in just thinking about that and like that piece of legislation, what could that do to workers and for workers in the country is pretty, you can sort of apply some of those common good principles to that.
Yeah.
In light of all of the discussion about the common good and also looking at the world we have at the moment, which is arguably not wired towards the common good in the ways that we might hope, what gives you hope that it might come to be wired that way?
Knowing that you might ask this question, the first thing that came to mind is the most unworldly thing there could possibly be, I think, which is the doctrine of the Trinity. When I had a job having to teach Christian doctrine, I had to learn the doctrine of the Trinity in a way I never had to learn it before. I found it the most edifying new dimension in my Christian faith that there has been for many decades. And one can say it is relevant to our topic today because God as one being in three persons, each, one can say, making room for the other person to be the person he is within the unity of God. God's very being is the unimaginably perfect common good. And one way of characterizing the Christian gospel is that God, in God's graciousness, has opened God's very being up to us to participate in communion with God in eternity. A common good formed among God's people, brought into perfected relationship with God in God's being as one in three. That's just a few sentences, but I find the vision of God and of the gracious offer of salvation that the doctrine of the Trinity enables us to see so mind-blowing that, having many years being a Christian, I find it is a constant source of inspiration. It can't not be that, because it transcends what we know now so much, yet it is open to us. So that's an answer to the question about hope.
Thanks for sharing that. That's quite good.
It's a surprising answer. Our next question that we always ask our academics is, what is your most controversial opinion? And another way to phrase that would be, if you were in a room full of people from your field, which I assume is political theology, given what we've talked about, what is something that you would likely disagree with other people about?
This is a very good question to ask people. I suppose it poses the question in return about the extent to which people have answered it honestly, because of course one might have an opinion that is so controversial that you wouldn't want to put it on the internet. And I have to confess I did wonder about not answering it in the most obvious way in which I can answer it, because I do have a view on one public issue that has now come to be seen as extremely controversial. Although, let's say 20 years ago, the view I have would not have been seen as controversial at all, and for a lot of people it still isn't controversial. But the view is this: the shift to gay marriage in Western societies about a decade ago was a pivotal moment of change away from the goods that a liberal democratic society gives us. It was a bad move. But the reasons I think that are not the kinds of reasons that many Christian people did appeal to in opposing that change. The reasons are essentially this, that I think that the arguments that were made for that change at the time were not intellectually cogent arguments. And I think that the advocates of that change at the time, and I'm thinking about the UK, and I'm thinking about New Zealand as well, and I'm thinking about the United States, among other places, I think that many of the advocates of that change, broadly speaking, are identified with liberalism, broadly speaking, a liberal position in public life. Liberal is a very big word that has multiple meanings. We've used it a little bit this morning in various ways without exploring its range of meanings. And that's not wrong to say that those people advocating that, broadly speaking, represented a liberal position. They understood that that change was justified. They thought it was justified by their liberalism. But I think it wasn't. I think the arguments for that change were bad arguments. And I think that the main advocates of that position coming from a sort of liberal position, the liberal political tradition has sought to be the tradition of reason in Western politics. And yet on that issue, the self-professed liberals, as it were, gave up on the use of critical reason about the arguments that they were making for that change. And I think it was a very significant moment in which the liberal political tradition in the Western world gave up on the politics of reason. And I think that was a significant change which may not endure. I'm not convinced the change will endure more than about 30 or 40 years, in fact, but we can't go into that now. One way of explaining the objection is this, which isn't to make a sufficient argument for what I've just said. I don't think there's anything wrong with a language having a word for what marriage used to mean, which is a certain kind of relationship that can exist between a man and a woman only, defined partly by consummation, which is a reference to a particular kind of sexual relationship. It's not wrong for a language to have a word for that. It's no more wrong for a language to have a word for that kind of relationship than for a language to have the term heterosexual relationship. It is not wrong for a language to have a word for what marriage has now come to mean in light of the change, which is a gender-neutral conception of relations between two people. It is not wrong for a language to have words for both those kinds of things. But I don't think it is possible to argue on the basis of either equality or anti-discrimination for a change from one to the other. And what the change to gay marriage amounted to was, in the end, the state saying to a lot of people, you must not use this word and certain other words in the way you were taught at school to use that word. It's unacceptable in that sense now. And I think that the pivot that represented was very significant for the move to a kind of post-truth politics. It was a move to a kind of politics that was kind of post-rational in ways that we hadn't experienced so much in previous decades. And the manifestations of kind of post-truth, post-rational politics in recent times have been obvious to everyone. And I'm afraid I think that the liberals are significantly to blame because they failed to bring their critical rational faculties when that demand came up from a certain very impressive lobby group. That is a controversial opinion. That's a big, 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 big subject, which would take another 2-hour discussion to try to unwrap. Yeah. But I think it was a very significant change. Christianity it's not in the business of defending. It doesn't exist to defend a traditional conception of marriage. That's not what it's there for. The gospel actually properly generates a form of community in which it doesn't matter whether people are married or single or whatever. That's the form of community that the gospel properly generates. And yet sometimes some of the ways of campaigning about marriage that some Christian groups and so on participate in, it can almost seem that Christianity exists not least to defend a traditional Christian marriage. That's not the gospel. In the good society, marriage is relativized by the gospel. I'd put it like that.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. That is our final question that we always ask people is, what books would you recommend to young people and and or movies or podcasts.
So I've in effect already recommended a bit of Pope John Paul II, Pope Francis strongly, Charles Taylor. I would recommend reading the Bible. It's an overlooked source by many Christians in the academic world. I say that with some seriousness. I need to read the Bible more myself, I should add. I've already alluded to the influence of Charles Taylor in my thought, and I would strongly recommend just trying to get a grasp of the perspectives that Charles Taylor has brought to philosophy and sociology and so on. They are very rich perspectives. He himself is a Christian. He's a Roman Catholic Christian, as it happens. He has not commented much in his writing on the sources, on the formation of his own thought, but some of the immediate post-war Catholic writers who then went on to influence the Second Vatican Council, he encountered when he was about in his early 20s, and I think they were formative for his mind. He did an interview with the British magazine, The New Statesman, a few years ago, where he spoke about that. But there may be lots of other places he's spoken about those formational that formation which I don't know of. I did mention the book Sources of the Self. That's one of his books. Let me say I still think it's the best book I've ever read in my life. I'll mention two other much more recent books from recent years. One is by a British academic who's based in the United States. He's a historian called Carl Trueman. It's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a very fine book. It is he takes Charles Taylor, Alistair McIntyre, and the late American sociologist and cultural critic called Philip Reef. He takes their perspectives that they each give as a basis for interpreting certain movements in modern thought since about the 18th century, and Rousseau has a very prominent place in the story he tells. I think it's an excellent book. I think it's also flawed in various ways, which I can't go into now, except that I'll say that it's a pity that his agenda is not broader to issues around, say, economics and business life that we've been touching on, because the sources he draws on, Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre and Philip Reef, have as much to say about those issues as they do about the issues around sexuality and sexual revolution as he is addressing. I do recommend it as a very insightful book, and I would dare say, Mika, it might give you a challenging perspective on the role of Rousseau in modern Western thought. Yes, look, it's been really, really great talking with you today. And I've suggested that we conclude with a prayer.
Yes. Yeah.
I hope that's appropriate. And the background on the prayer is that it was written by a friend of mine in the UK who is an Anglican vicar. So my friend Jonathan wrote the prayer that we will pray. I have amended it in certain ways, but it's still essentially his prayer. I think it might be great if one of you read the prayer. Would you mind doing that? So we can pray this prayer as a prayer for Wellington and the Wellington region where we are. It's a prayer for the city. Over to you, Rayne.
It's called Blessings on the City. Gracious Father, by your holy prophets you taught your ancient people to seek the common good of the cities and communities in which they lived. We commend now our city to your care. Look with favour on all its residents. Bless and give grace, wisdom and understanding to all in authority. We thank you for those who, day and night, maintain our public services, and we pray that you will sustain them, for the police, for those who respond to emergencies and keep us safe, for those who work in health or healing or social care. Give energy to and inspire all in commerce, community organisations, and our places of learning. Grant them a clear sense of the distinctive and important roles they have to play. We ask in your name that our city might be kept free from social strife and decay. Give us strength of purpose and concern for others, that we may make here a shared life of justice and the common good, where your will is done. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciated having you.
Oh, that's very moving, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to this whole podcast, and thanks to Nick for coming and speaking to us. We want to end with one final quote, which, once again, Nick had included in the interview, but also had to be cut due to audio issues. The quote is from Dorothy Day, the writer and founder of the Catholic worker movement, and reads, "We cannot know God unless we love each other, and to love Him we must know each other. We know Him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust, where there is companionship. We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community."